This is Grafted Together with ACSI Chief Ministry Officer Jerry Nelson.
So how does a Christian school decide what it's going to focus on? How does a Christian school even know it's being successful? Well, that's really the topic of what we're going to discuss today. This whole idea of expected student outcomes. So I ask you, what are the expected student outcomes of your school? What goals are you trying to hit? And I want to ask one more question for you to ponder on. Does that align with what God has called us to do to advance his kingdom? Hi, I'm Jerry Nelson, and this is Grafted Together. And I want to remind all of you that spiritual formation matters. And so my guest today is, he's not a guest, man. He's like family. It's Josh Leonard. Josh and his wife, Abby, live in North Carolina with three children, Julia, Liam, and Jacob. And after studying psychology at the University of Florida, Josh earned his Master's of Divinity degree from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in Wake Forest, North Carolina. Josh has served for 5 years and now 6 years at North Raleigh Christian Academy and is currently leading in the role of Dean of Spiritual Formation and Discipleship. He is passionate about seeing the next generation come to know who Jesus is and live out the calling that God has placed on their lives. And as a part of his role at NRCA, Josh is also intentional in developing resources for parents, churches, and Christian schools, including hosting the Rooted Rhythms podcast, which is on our ACSI Spiritual Formation page. So make sure you guys go and check that out, which seeks to engage in conversations surrounding the intentional pursuit of Jesus through the rhythms of our lives. Josh, fam, welcome back, brother, man. How you doing?
It feels like coming home. I always love the chance to get to sit down with the Jerry Nelson, and really anything you ever want to talk about, I am up for talking about it. So, but today's topic especially, I'm excited about it. Thanks for having me.
Checks in the mail, bro. Checks in the mail. Appreciate you, man. Man, let's jump right in, man. We could talk for days on almost any topic, but we're as you know, you're a big part of us helping to lead our spiritual formation, our newly formed spiritual formation newly branded, I should say, spiritual formation network. You've been a key part of helping to advise us on best strategies, and we're walking through our spiritual formation journey map, which has those four areas where we talk about, you need to know where your starting point is, training for the journey or equipping for the journey, hardships and care and hardships. But that last part, which is really the first part, is every school needs to determine what their expected student outcomes. Some people say the portrait of a graduate, and I want to talk about that today. There's a lot of folks who are coming into Christian education who may not have heard of these terms, expected student outcomes, or even the portrait of the graduate. So I don't want to assume that folks know exactly what we're talking about. So Josh, from your perspective, can you define for our audience and our listeners what are expected student outcomes?
Sure. I love that we're starting here because as somebody who did not come through Christian education, I went through Christian education through 8th grade growing up, but public school starting in 9th grade, as you said, the University of Florida, didn't return back to Christian education until Southeastern. And I could not have told you 6 years ago what expected student outcomes were, what their purpose was. I could have probably gathered some context clues there, but their specific role and their necessity within the concept of Christian education, I wouldn't have been able to define it even just as starting out here at North Raleigh. For us here at NRCA, expected student outcomes, or ESOs, as I'm sure we'll call it here on this episode, are used to essentially define what we are intentionally targeting for our students to know, understand, and believe when they complete their time at NRCA. And it's kind of a broad definition here, but I'd love to, if you'll allow me to give a little bit of an example here. It's a strategy or an exercise that I've used for some different leadership teams. I used it for our administrative leadership team this year, where I asked them to do me a favor. And I asked them if they would write for us on a sheet of paper. And really, they did it individually for themselves. if they had the opportunity after the Lord were to call them home to just peek back the curtain and look into their funeral, and they're just listening to what is being described as their character of who they were as a person, who was it that they embodied while they were here on earth? What were the things that they would love to hear written down, right? And you get a lot of different answers here. There's infinite answers, but you hear often a person of integrity, right? A man or a woman of the Lord, someone who was compassionate, someone who was willing to step into the needs of other people. And you start that exercise to then begin to ask the question, so what are you doing now toward that end, right? What is it that we're doing here day in and day out toward this goal of being a person of integrity, of compassion? Because those things don't happen by accident. They're not happenstance. And so when I think of ESOs, I think of this type of strategy or this type of exercise where we are looking at the end and we're beginning with the end in mind. We want to have our students know, understand, and believe these things. And we can begin to ask the question of, so what are we doing right now toward that end?
Yeah, I love that idea. And I know Stephen Covey didn't invent this. I mean, this is very, very biblical, right? Seek first the
That's right.
kingdom of God and his righteousness, and then everything else will be added unto you. So, what we aim for really matters. But this whole idea of really beginning with the end in mind is really critical. Now, I want to kind of pivot. I think our listeners would definitely agree with that. Beginning with the end in mind. I love the exercise that you did with your administrative team, but from a Christian standpoint, and of course, the buzzword is from a biblical worldview. What do you expect the student? What should be our expected student outcomes? And let me kind of add a little bit to that.
Yeah,
I think both you and I have had this discussion on and off. Like, I think some people who, Christians tend to at times have this dualistic, understanding. It's like it's either academics or spiritual, or
that's right.
sometimes it seems like academic and spiritual are kind of at odds with each other. But I know that's not how Scripture really presents that. So, from a biblical worldview, what should expected student outcomes be, especially in an academic setting? What does that
Right.
look like?
It's a great question. I actually had this conversation with one of our teachers at the end of last year because I think you're exactly right. Whereas we wouldn't articulate often this duality or this dualistic perspective of academia versus spiritual formation and that they're at odds. But as we navigate just the day to day and the things that need to be done, the things that need to be accomplished, the focus can so often swing the pendulum to feel like we're having to when we talk about biblical worldview integration in a classroom, well, we've got to find this like niche to stick this verse in or to stick this space here. And that's not what we're trying to do at all. We are trying to help our students to recognize and understand that the Bible, the Word of God, is the living, breathing words of our Creator. And so we are seeking to bring that very word into the reality in which they walk. And
Mhm.
so academia is not, okay, let's do science and then we'll get to Bible and then we'll integrate a little bit of this niche or this space. It's that we are walking, hopefully, in lockstep with where the Spirit is leading, and we are using the very words of our Creator as our guide. And so as we navigate science and history and math, we are starting with His Word. We are starting with the direction that He provides through His Word. And then we're branching from there into helping our students to realize the reality that they experience is not separate from the spiritual. It's not split in half. It is integrated completely. And can we show them where that truth is clear and aligned with what they experience day in and day out?
Yeah, and it seems like this is an exercise that school leaders need to do on a regular basis to,
Yeah.
I think, first of all, just understand like what target are we hitting? The way I like to think about it, there's a broader target that everyone in the kingdom has to hit, right?
Mm,
So there are expected, servant outcomes, for everyone. Jesus outlines that, I think, most prolifically in the Sermon on the Mount. This is what if you're going to be a citizen of the kingdom, this is what it is expected of you. And I think every believer has a responsibility to really try and wrestle with that as well. But God puts us in certain areas where we're required to carry out, that particular area in that time and space where God requires us to carry out
Mm.
the ultimate mandates of the kingdom itself. And so, my next question is simply this, or I'll just throw out something for you to kind of muse on. I'm just wondering, can you really do your job effectively as a Christian educator if you don't have clear expected student outcomes? Can you do your job
Hmm.
effectively?
That that is a great question. And it's interesting because I think you kind of when you ask that question, you kind of touch on this difference between functioning and flourishing, right? We use the word flourishing a lot often
Mhm.
in conversations. And if I think about that question that you ask, I'm I'm reminded of conversations that I
Mhm.
often have with students in my office, and we've had it from time to time where a student will come in and they'll say, I don't worship anything. I don't believe in anything. I don't there is nothing that I worship. And in those conversations, I understand what they're trying to say, right? That they do not align their worldview or their emphases or what they're pursuing toward any end or whatever they're trying to communicate here in this moment. But in our conversation, we get to the place where I try to help them understand, no, you do in fact worship something, right? You
Mhm.
do in fact worship something in your life based off of whatever it is that you emphasize, wherever it is that you put your time and your energy and the desires of your heart toward the things in which you behold
Yep.
are the things that impact your behavior. Those are the things that you worship. And so when I'm reminded of that when I think about your question here of can you do education without ESOs? Potentially, you could say we don't have a written state of here are our expected student outcomes. Perhaps there's not a specific outline of that here, but without to say that you don't have them, I don't think would be true because there, even if you may not have them stated, there are still outcomes for your students. The things that you emphasize, the things that you put your time and your energy toward are the things that are going to impact the students that you produce. And so whether that's being impacted by the intrinsic culture of your staff, of your hallways, of your student body, essentially what you say when you say, well, we do them, if you were to say we do it without ESOs, is that we kind of just do it by happenstance. Just
Yeah.
whatever the culture is kind of the current that moves it. And really what it becomes is that you realize that ESOs provide this framework for you to be able to see this is where we're headed. So here's the guardrails toward the direction of where we want to go.
It reminds me of another book, as our listeners can realize that I've read a lot of self-help books over the years. So I'm still reading through my Bible to get some of that bad psychology out of my head. But Stephen Covey, he wrote another book. In addition to Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, he wrote a book called Seven Habits of Highly Effective Families, which is kind of a
Mm,
rip off of the Seven Habits, his original Seven Habits book. But he opens the book with this great analogy that has to do with his first principle, right? Beginning with the end in mind. He
yeah.
says that a pilot files a flight plan. And a part of that flight plan is a route that they're going to take, and they have to
Yep.
file that, and then they'll get clearance as it relates to whether they can, when they're going to take off, when they're going to land, where they're going to, in the route they're going to fly. But what Covey says, I think, is really, really profound. He says that that pilot is going to be off 90% of the time. And it's a very profound thing. It's like he's going to be off 90% of the time. That's because he's going to have to make course corrections, or he or she is going to have to make course corrections, right?
That's
They're
it.
going, they're going to have to fly around some bad weather, depending on which airport they're flying into. The
That's
pilot
right.
landing before them might not know how to do their job effectively. So they got a circle, they might have an incident on the plane, an
Yep.
emergency that causes them to have to go to one of their prescribed emergency landing spots. But the goal is always get to your particular destination. And
That's it.
so, when I think about ESOs, I think about it along those lines. It's not that you set these things, out, not that everything's going to naturally fall into place, but it at least allows you to know how to course correct because you're clear on what your end goal is.
That's it. It's not a formula, it's a framework, right? It's
Yeah.
not a plus B plus C equals this. I often, even just personally, this is just a Josh Leonard thing, that I struggle sometimes with the statement of a portrait of a graduate, because I
Mhm.
think even that statement alone can sometimes infer that, like, if you graduate, here's your portrait, right? And so I
Mhm.
tend to navigate towards the expected student outcomes, which gives kind of that a little bit more leniency there toward the that it's not a formula of A plus B plus C. You walk these hallways and then you walk across the stage and you've gone through almost a car wash of education, and you come out clean and shiny and
Yeah,
ready
we're
to
not
rock and
producing
roll.
widgets, as they say.
No, the thing for it here. I shared this with our seniors last year. Even is that we talk often, you and I, about words and language that sometimes lose their meaning, and I feel like one of those words is intentionality, and we
Mhm.
use this word intentionality often, and we use it with ESOs a lot, right? We're doing things with intentionality, and when we say that we're doing it intentionally, I think sometimes people begin to think that intentionally means we're doing it on purpose, that
Mhm.
it's part of the programming. But
Mhm.
intentionality is not doing something on purpose, it's doing something with purpose, right?
Uh,
And we
Good.
know that intellectually, but then in applying it day in and day out, sometimes we say, well, we're doing it intentionally because it's part of the program. And it's not about the program, right? It's
Mhm.
about the people. It's about, we have a purpose where we desire this to be the outcome for our students at the end. And that gives us the opportunity to course correct in the midst of the
Yeah.
journey of that.
That's really good advice, Josh, because I think to your point about what's the focus here? It's the people.
It's the
And
people.
so, in looking at those expected student outcomes, it would seem that as educators, we've got to be willing to ditch the program if
Mm.
it's not serving the people effectively.
Hmm. Yes, you're opening a door here that may go broader or deeper than we have time for, but I'll jump into it anyway. The I This was part of the leadership training that we did administratively this summer too, where I shared with them. You hear often in institutions that it's a big machine, right? It's one big program, and I've actually heard it myself in a number of different places, and it really began to spur in my head. Okay, so what makes people feel like they're just part of a big machine, right? We're just
Mhm.
trying to churn out cookie cutter products, whether that's graduates or actual products to be sold in the marketplace. And what I shared with them was that's it is this concept of, as leaders, are you leading people or programs? Because when
Mhm.
you lead the program instead of the people begin to feel like the replaceable parts of a machine, right? They're just a cog in the wheel. If it doesn't work, just we've got to keep the machine moving. And the crazy thing, this is what I shared with them, is there are institutions that do that and they can be successful. It's not a pathway to failure to prioritize programs over people. But the question becomes, what is the outcome that you expect, what you want? Because if our expected outcome is that we are producing in people a way of life that aligns with the calling of Jesus on our life, then the program can't be the priority. It's got to be the people. You have to know the people you're leading to best know what those programs should even be.
Your comment reminds me of kind of what, I see kind of historically, at least over the last 150 years, there's this industrial mindset that's kind of
Yeah.
been programmed into not just the American psyche, just kind of the Western psyche. We even
Yeah.
divide up, the way that we think about the world, the underdeveloped world or the undeveloped
Mhm.
world as lacking the means to effective production. But we know that what we experience, what we are experiencing now, is really the product of the last 150 years, where
Mhm.
most of the world understood the world in terms of farming, not
Mhm.
produce,
It's
not
good.
factory, but it was farming. And
Real
go
good.
back to your original point about flourishing. It's like, what's the end goal? And again, talk about going down a rabbit trail, man. We could talk about what happens when you produce food organically versus, when it's machine produced and the effects
That's
that it
it.
had on, our health as well. But hey, man, I want to get a little practical for our listeners. And
Yeah.
what are NRCA's expected student outcomes? How are you going about building those into your school programs? How do you go about the process of aligning?
That's a great question. So for us at NRCA, our ESOs are written in a way where we have kind of four umbrellas, or some people say buckets. I like the term of kind of this overhang of umbrella that we work underneath. So for us, the four umbrellas, very broad, are spiritual formation, worldview orientation, academic thinking, and
Mhm.
skills development. So their spiritual formation, worldview orientation, academic thinking, skills development, those serve as kind of these umbrellas from which we start and begin to flesh out underneath. For me, just I'm a words guy. I'm an alliterative guy. Those help me to provide these kind of bite-sized ways for us to really latch onto things. And so for me, the most concise way, the simplest way that I scale it down is that in what we're trying to do, I'm seeking to engage, and you've heard this before, the head, the hearts, and the hands of our students. So
Mhm.
when we talk about spiritual formation, I'm seeking to engage their hearts. Talk about academic thinking, I'm seeking to engage their head, skills development, their hands, and worldview orientation kind of interweaves this thread line through all three of them.
If I'm understanding this correctly, the worldview orientation is the story that kind of binds it all together.
That's it. That's it. That's
Yeah,
exactly
no,
it.
that's give me an example of, in each of those areas, how you are doing things with purpose
Yeah.
at NRCA.
Yeah, it's a so for us that's a and again this is a really broad conversation, so I'll try to keep it kind of as concise here.
Mhm.
There
Yeah.
when you start talking about academically and spiritually and physically and relationally or socially, right? We use Luke 2:52 often, right? And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature in favor with God and man, and so when we're looking to engage our students at each of those levels, you have to again begin with the end in mind, right? So academically, we have these objectives that we're using here, and we're evaluating those through typical or traditional means, right? You're looking at those through test scores, GPA data. There's a little bit more objectivity in ways that you can evaluate how we're
Mhm.
engaging the heads of our students in their ability to transfer information. When you start coming into where I sit most often, which is the spiritual realm, it's much different, right? You're
Mhm.
you're talking about something, and here's a space where it gets a real the tension, you begin to feel it, right? Where we have outcomes that we have no control over, right? I
Mhm.
can walk faithfully in my shepherding, in my direction of students, and yet ultimately it's the Lord who calls the individual. And
Right.
it's the Lord's timing in which what he is doing within their life. And so, how do we measure this spiritual growth or this spiritual application and the programming or how we're engaging them based off of the results that we may not see while they walk the hallways of NRCA? I've had an example and this is just a praise very quickly here, even just publicly, that we had a student just reach out to a teacher just in the last couple of weeks that's a recent graduate here, and of his own speaking and sharing with her was just he did not, while he walked the halls here, he did not believe anything of what he was hearing. In fact, was mostly antagonistic toward it. And yet, since leaving and starting his time in college, he was sharing with her how the Lord had really taken hold of his heart, and he had begun to wrestle with some of the things that he struggled with in the past. And what was interesting about that story for me is that if you take the data point of senior year walk across the stage, that's a young man that it didn't seem like what we were doing really took root. And yet the Lord was doing things we didn't even know about. And so much so that when he really began to recognize what the Lord was doing, he reached out to one of his former teachers because
Mhm.
she was one who really spread the seed that began to take root there in his life. And so those are the gifts, those are the moments where we
Mhm.
say, man, when we're evaluating data, it becomes difficult because the Lord's doing a work in his timing in each of their lives, and we're seeking faithfulness in that. I don't know if that makes sense, but
No, that makes perfect sense. In fact, you know, our listeners may not be familiar with the Flourishing Faith Index, but
I was going to mention that next. I'm glad you did.
yeah, it
Yep.
affirms exactly what you said. You know, when they were really designing the instrument itself, you know, that was one of the things is like the scriptures are very clear. Who can know the heart, say for God?
Right.
God is
That's it.
the only person can know the heart. But, you know, one of the things that I really love about the instrument, you know, it's a 360-degree instrument. It measures, you know, seven constituent groups. And one of the things is it measures alumni. And it says that they're and the idea is that alumni are the one of the constructs, the way it's framed. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but that alumni report that they're still walking with the Lord, or alumni report that because they went to a Christian school, they have a deeper relationship with the Lord. And I think the point that you're making here, Josh, is that Christian educators, I think, need to take a longer view of what it is that they're doing. And while
Hmm.
it is tempting, to your point, to measure those data points right away as soon as they graduate, but you're right. It's like we do not know what God's doing in their heart on both sides. And you know, one example I always think about is Judas. It's like Judas walked with
That's
Jesus for
it.
like 3.5 years.
Yep.
Like, man, look what he did.
Right.
Go
That's
ahead.
exactly it. You want to take a longer view and also just an open-handed view, right? It's one in which, I was reading some of the Inspire protocol that Dr. Erin Wilcox, she did a fantastic job through some of this ESO things here. And one of the things she said that really spurred great thought for me in this is how often we can find ourselves using these really small sample size
Mhm.
and examples to dictate the programming of what we do on both sides. That's the thing of data, right? Is that you can make data say most things that you want it to say, right? So when we look at data and we say, well, we have this program and holistically the numbers don't indicate that we're achieving what we want. But think about this example and think about this example, and you get a handful of examples that doesn't indicate that you should just maintain the status quo. And the opposite is true too, right? When you have a program and then you hear from a parent or from a student or from a stakeholder that says, "Yeah, but I know this group of friends that doesn't live that out or this thing that isn't indicative of that." That doesn't inherently mean that we need to uproot the programming and completely shift our course correction.
Right.
This is where we approach what we're doing with open hands, looking, seeking discernment and direction from the Spirit. There's a pure reliance on the Lord that's required in these things where we continually remind ourselves that ESOs again are not a formula, they're a
Yeah.
framework.
Yeah. Now that's good. And this is such good stuff, man. But I want to again trying to keep it practical, you know,
Yep.
recognizing that you know, our main audience is spiritual life directors, generally speaking, but we definitely have heads of schools in the mix, or you know, individuals who've been assigned as the spiritual champions within their school. So, you know, the
Yep.
head of schools, they can snap their fingers like, man, we're going to do this ESO thing like right now. If we don't
Yeah.
have it, we're going to put this on the books. You know, but for the spiritual life director or the spiritual champion in the school who don't have that level of authority, what advice would you give them
Mm.
for, you know, at least trying to develop a framework?
Yep.
Again, that one that's not contradictory to what the school's goals are, but one that would be complementary, knowing that the school may not have developed some clear expected student outcomes?
That it's a great question, and there's many that I would say for this. I think, one of the first things that I would start with is that you want to not only know what those ESOs are. So we kind of kicked off the conversation talking about how there's a potential or a possibility that you may not have really clearly defined expected student outcomes. It's a great place to start, right? It's a great place to start to not only clearly define them, but here's the real specific aspect is when we talk about ESOs, that middle word is incredibly important. These are expected student outcomes. And so if your students cannot grasp what the expected student outcomes are, then we're probably not in a place where we want to begin to build off of that, right? We want them to be able to really understand where we're headed, what we're doing. One of the practical ways that we do this here that we have found great success is you bring them into the conversation of what those outcomes are, not inherently in choosing what the ESOs are going to be, but when you've established them, we have our students, we do this in athletics, we do it in the classroom, really simple
Mhm.
exercise that's done often, but you give them an opportunity to reflect on where they've been. Perhaps for me in our leadership program that we do, where were you last year in your walk with the Lord, in the ways that you were using the leadership gifts He's given you to impact the culture of your hallways? And now, after you've reflected on that, where would you like to move? Where would you like to go? What do you see as a need in the circle around you, and where your passion and gifting intersects with that need? And so now you've brought them into the conversation where we're not just saying, hey, we want you to be a better leader on campus, or we want you to impact your students. We're not being general about it. We're bringing them into the application and giving a voice of truth, of scripture, of biblically grounded direction in what
Right.
we're doing. And so doing that gives a great clarity for our students to be able to say, okay, I can understand where I'm trying to go so that I know as I'm moving within the hallways where my guardrails are. That would be one that I would start with for sure.
Now that's really good. And I really love the aspect of inviting the students in the conversation. I mean, we know from years of research on student learning that engagement is key. If you can increase the engagement and the
That's
ownership
it.
of the student in the process, or if you increase the engagement, they're going to feel greater ownership of that, and
That's
they're
it.
going to be invested, in that outcome together. Man, Josh, this
That's
is
it.
awesome. This has been amazing. And Josh, man, I'd love to put you on blast and just simply say, hey, listen, Josh is a wealth of wisdom to our listeners. If you guys want to learn more about what NRCA, North Raleigh Christian Academy, is doing, and especially what Josh is doing in the area of spiritual formation and helping to lead, as you guys can hear, he's not just leading students, he's also helping to lead the faculty to help them to think well about their spiritual formation and discipleship responsibility. Josh, before I get you out of here, man, want to let our listeners also know that we have the first of four of our spiritual formation network meetings coming up. Man, we have a rock star lineup.
Yep.
September 9th, we have Dr. Annie Gallagher of Transformed PD.
She's awesome.
She's awesome, man. She's going to be talking about expected student outcomes. And then we're going to have an opportunity. Josh is going to be there, and we're going to do breakout sessions. And so, if you want to come and talk about expected student outcomes after Dr. Gallagher presents, we're going to break out into three groups. We're going to have a group that's focused on students. We'll have a group focused on parents, groups focused on teachers. Hey, Josh, I mean, I don't know if you got a plug for this, man. Go ahead if you do.
Yes, yes, I would love to plug this. This has been over the past year such an incredible experience for myself, and just hearing the words of other spiritual life directors, spiritual champions on their campus to come connect with others. This is the nature of what we're doing when we talk about open-handed ministry through Christian education. The voice of other people walking serving in the trenches, walking the lanes that you're walking. This is going to be a great opportunity to to gain insight from Christian school leaders across the country, but also to be encouraged. I'll add a kind of a final wrap up here to even another practical application to ESOs and all the ministry you're doing within Christian education. And I don't say this last because it's the least important. I say it last for emphasis because it's the most important. We want to cover everything we're doing in prayer. We recognize what the Lord is doing. We recognize that He is the one spurring us on. And so having an opportunity in these spiritual formation networks to gather together, to pray over one another, to encourage each other with the truth of Scripture is a gift. And it's one that I've been incredibly thankful for personally. And I hope you'll come and join us. I'm excited to do it.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Josh. And if you want to register for the Spiritual Formation Network meetings, make sure you go to ACSI, type in to your browser, ACSI Convene, CONVENE, ACSI Convene. Josh, man, I really, really appreciate you. I love you, brother. Love having these conversations with you. And it's always good to be able to bounce wisdom and knowledge off each other. Appreciate you.
I love you, brother. I appreciate the time. Thanks, man.
Grafted Together is a presentation of the Association of Christian Schools International. Learn more about biblical worldview and spiritual formation at acsi.org/graftedtogether.